To Jody Trexler, the summer of her 13th year was one that should have been filled with simple joys, warm days, late nights, and the anticipation of starting high school in the fall. Her older sister, Risa, 15, was preparing for her junior year. They lived in a quiet southern town, the kind of place where everyone knows everyone, and nothing truly bad ever seemed to happen. But that summer, their world would break apart, and the community would be haunted by a tragedy that remained unsolved for over 3 decades. Jody and Risa had always been close, sharing secrets and stories the way sisters often do. But as Risa matured, the natural drift of adolescence began to pull them apart. Risa was blossoming into her teenage years, making new friends and carving out her identity. Jody, still straddling the line between childhood and adolescence, felt the subtle sting of distance, but still adored her big sister. It was one of those summer days that started just like all others. Risa had invited friends over, and her house was loud with laughter and the sound of MTV in the background. Paul, the charismatic California transplant, all long hair and skateboard/cool, held a mesmerized court in the small southern town. Jim was funny, and quietly held a big secret crush on Risa, though he knew it probably would never see its return. They were teenagers in the woods, and their summer was free. Late in the afternoon, the mood shifted. Risa announced that her favorite soap was about to start, which was greeted by groans and complaints from the guys. Jim had to leave for his part-time job at a fast food restaurant, and Paul tagged after him. The house grew as quiet as a tomb, leaving the 2 girls alone. One of those moments in the middle of a routine, unremarkable late summer afternoon. But little did Jody know, this was going to be the last memory she would have of her sister alive. Later on, Jody realized Risa had left the house. Thinking that her sister must have gone next door to their grandparents' house, she didn't think much about it. But looking out her window toward her grandparents' house, something caught her eye. Their cars were gone, and the door was shut, a detail that seemed odd but not immediately alarming. Still, Jody brushed it off and returned to her room, where she spent the next hour listening to the radio and chatting on the phone with friends. But all the peace was broken when Jody saw her grandfather burst out of the house screaming. She had fear in her heart and ran towards him. Entering the house, she called her sister's name as she raced through the house. She saw nothing out of place in the living room. Then her worst nightmare became real as she turned the corner. She found Risa's body in the spare bedroom. Blood was everywhere. Jody was in a state of shock, her mind whirling in horror at the sight before her. Her sister was gone, so full of life and energy. The blanket over Risa covered all but a portion of her hair and face. The silence was oppressive, as if no one would tell her because the truth was too unbearable. The police came, and a quiet neighborhood became a scene of chaos. Officers and investigators went through the house, putting together what happened. It was a brutally violent crime unimaginable. Risa had been stabbed several times. Her body told of a violent struggle. A knife, lodged in her shoulder, left there a chilling signature of the killer's rage. This small community was terrified. How could this terrible thing happen here? And who could have done it? The lack of answers only heightened the unease. There were no witnesses, and the evidence was scant, so the investigation hit an immediate roadblock. All they had was Risa's body and that haunting scene of the crime. Rumors, fed by fear and suspicion, began to fly around. In this inbred town where everybody knew everybody, fingers were pointed in all directions. Paul and Jim, the last known visitors, immediately fell under suspicion. The police questioned them time and again, trying to find cracks in their stories. But amidst all the stress, no evidence linked them to the crime. As the weeks turned into months, the case grew colder. With no clear suspect, the circle of suspicion widened. To Jody's shock, the focus eventually turned to her. Investigators began to question her alibi, speculating that she might have been involved in her sister's murder. The theory seemed implausible. How could a 13-year-old overpower her older sister and commit such a violent act? But the lack of evidence left the police grasping at straws. The scrutiny was something she could not take. Friends became enemies, her every move a whisper wherever she went, and even her own family began to question her blamelessness. The best friend of Risa, once an ally to Jody, turned into one of her fiercest adversaries by spreading rumors that contributed to the suspicion in town. And the blame hung over her head like a mountain, covering her whole life in shadow. Years turned into decades, and the case remained unsolved. Jody's name was forever tied to her sister's murder, a cloud of doubt and mistrust hanging over her. She endured relentless bullying, both in person and online. Even as an adult, she couldn't escape the past. Social media became a new battleground, with groups dedicated to vilifying her. The pain was inescapable. She, by this time, was desperate to be vindicated, so she resorted to the only avenue that was left to be tried, a public plea for the truth. Desperate, she wrote the producers of the popular talk show, describing in detail her tale and begging the producer to help her. The show host would introduce the case on his show and grant Jody an opportunity to clear her name through a polygraph test. It just confirmed what she knew all the time: innocent. The renewed attention brought the case back into the spotlight, and with advances in forensic technology, investigators revisited the evidence. There came a breakthrough when analysts applied genealogical DNA testing, a cutting-edge tool that had solved many cold cases. They were able to trace the DNA left at the crime scene to a distant relative, narrowing down the pool of potential suspects. After 30 years, they finally had a name: Curtis Edward Blair. Blair was a name nobody in the community knew. He worked at a factory nearby at the time of Risa's murder but was long gone, relocated to California, where he built up a criminal record including assault with a deadly weapon. But justice was elusive. By the time investigators identified him, Blair had been dead for over a decade. The revelation was bittersweet for Jody. She was vindicated. Her name had been cleared after years of blame being undeservedly laid upon her. But the resolution came without the closure she had hoped for. Blair would never face trial, never answer for his crimes, and the questions that haunted her would remain unanswered. Why had he killed Risa? What had led him to target her? The answers died with him. The case may be closed, but the scars still remain. For Jody, the pain of losing her sister is further complicated by suspicion and a long period of isolation. But finally, she finds her peace in the truth. Risa's story is no longer one of mystery and blame. It is a story of resilience, sisterly love, and relentless pursuit of justice, even in unimaginable loss. For the Trexler family, life after Risa's murder was never the same. Jody's world was upended not only by the loss of her sister, but also by the suspicion that fell squarely on her shoulders. At 13, she was thrust into a nightmare she couldn't escape, a nightmare fueled by whispers, accusations, and a community desperate for answers. In those early days, the investigation focused on those closest to Risa. It's a sad truth in criminal cases. The first people looked at are usually those closest to the victim. Paul and Jim, the boys who had been at the Trexler house earlier that day, were interrogated relentlessly. The police pressed them for details, questioning their every move. Paul, with his laid-back California demeanor, and Jim, the class clown, suddenly found themselves under the harsh glare of suspicion. Paul called it a completely average day, watching MTV, horseplaying with Risa and Jody, and then leaving to go out with Jim. They vouched for each other, says Gary Merritt of the Des Moines Police Department. No one could put either boy at the scene. Yet the neighborhood was slow to let them be. It made Paul, as the new kid from California, an outsider, and rumors flowed easily his way. Jim's obvious crush on Risa had become fodder for wild speculation. But no matter how much the town gossiped, the police couldn't find a shred of evidence that would tie either boy to the murder. As the investigation stalled, the focus turned. Jody, who found her sister, now became suspect number one. It was a theory born not out of evidence, but of desperation. The investigators needed a lead, and with no clear answers, they turned their attention to the one person who couldn't definitively prove her innocence. Jody's young age didn't shield her from the accusations. Instead, it became part of the story, her supposed motive twisted into something sinister. The police theory was baffling. Instead, they theorized that in those 45 minutes between the time Risa was last seen alive and her body was found, Jody had somehow overpowered her sister, brutally attacked her, and left the scene without a speck of blood or injury. To anyone who knew Jody, the notion was preposterous. She was an introverted, shy teen and idolized her sister. But in the court of public opinion, fueled by rumors and speculation, the logic didn't matter. The scrutiny took a toll on Jody's family. Her parents, already devastated by the loss of one daughter, were now grappling with the possibility that their other child might somehow be involved. Jody's relationship with her mother, in particular, became strained. The police had planted seeds of doubt, and for a time, even her own family wavered. To this day, Jody would later recall, "I can't understand how my own mother could believe I had anything to do with it. I was her child. I needed her to believe me, and she didn't." But Jody wasn't the only one ensnared by suspicion. Risa's best friend, her once ubiquitous companion at the Trexler residence, became one of the louder rumors milling in and out of town. Her fuel was actually her grief, and perhaps a need for answers, in which she pointed at Jody and spread stories that only deepened the divide between Jody and the rest of the town. The mother was a worker at the local post office who shared the rumors with all who would listen. It quickly turned into a pressure cooker of suspicion and fear. With no arrest and no resolution, people began to question their neighbors, their friends, even their family members. For years, the shadow of an unsolved murder has loomed over Salisbury, North Carolina. Parents warned their kids not to walk alone, while teenagers swapped theories about what really happened that day. And through it all, the Trexler family was left to pick up the pieces. This stigma haunts her even as an adult. Trying to piece together some form of existence with whispers from a past she seemed to think no one noticed, on job sites, through neighborhoods, to even social media sites. They had called her murderer to her face, even went on to further tease her online, creating Facebook groups devoted to spewing false details of her involvement in the murder of Risa. But Jody would not go down without a fight. After years of suspicion, she decided to take matters into her own hands. She called the producers of Dr. Phil, hoping a public forum would help clear her name. The show agreed to feature her story, and Jody underwent a polygraph test in a bid to prove her innocence. The results, which had been broadcast for the world to see, finally confirmed what she had always known. She had nothing to do with her sister's murder. The renewed attention to the case had engendered a belief that, finally, a killer of Risa might be identified. Advances in DNA technology have solved countless cold cases in recent years, and investigators hoped it could do so for Risa, too. A small sample of DNA, long forgotten in evidence storage, was sent for testing using genealogical databases. Decades from the murder, the break came. Analysts found a match to distant relatives of the killer, which led them to Curtis Edward Blair. Blair was a name that no one in Salisbury knew. He had worked at a factory near the Trexler home at the time of the murder, but nobody knew he knew the family in any way. The violent offender had an assault with a deadly weapon in his criminal record and a perfect match of DNA from the scene of the crime. But justice came too late. Curtis Edward Blair had died in 2004, leaving behind a trail of unanswered questions. Why did he target Risa? Was this some random act of violence, or was there a motive no one could have imagined? The answers went to the grave with him, as the Trexler family came to grips with a bittersweet reality. Although they knew who it was, they'd never get closure. The revelation brought some measure of relief to Jody, the vilification having gone on for decades, but the scars from those years were deep. "I'll never get back the life I lost," she said. "At least now people know I didn't do it." Risa's murder serves as a painful chapter in the Salisbury history. how quickly a community can turn against their own out of fear and uncertainty. The case is also a testament to the power of persistence, technology, and the unyielding pursuit of justice, even when it comes decades too late. As for Jody, she still lives with her sister's memory and shares her story in the hope it may help others. It is a resilient story in unimaginable loss, a reminder that even from the darkest moments, the truth may yet shine through. The murder of Risa Trexler cast a long and devastating shadow over the lives of everyone involved. For over 3 decades, her death was an open wound within the Trexler family and a haunting mystery in the Salisbury community. Much of that shadow fell upon Jody Trexler, who lived her life under suspicion, accusation, and the ramifications of a crime committed by another person. She held on to her innocence in pain and isolation, and hoped that someday the truth would come out. The break in Risa's case has been a demonstration of how investigative tools and forensic science have come a long way. Genealogical DNA testing is the kind of technology that was unimaginable in the early 1980s, which brought the kind of answers that Risa's family could only dream of. It was this technological miracle that finally nailed Curtis Edward Blair as the perpetrator of the horrific crime. In resolution, though, even heartbreak remains. The death of Blair means he will never face justice, never explain his actions, nor be held accountable for the immense suffering he brought on. For Jody, the truth was a bittersweet vindication. The DNA evidence not only freed her from guilt, but also quieted the decades of rumors and accusations that painted her as the villain in her own sister's tragedy. A victory it was, but one which came at a great cost: years of trauma, loss of relationships, and that unrecoverable absence of her beloved sister. While justice, as it traditionally is, had never fully served its course in the case of Risa, her case does remind one of the ultimate triumph of perseverance. It impresses upon a person the futility of allowing a case to grow cold or the truth to get further away than it already might be. It was a grim reminder for the Salisbury community of how rumors and jumping to conclusions in the aftermath of tragedy can have devastating consequences. Nowadays, Jody keeps rebuilding her life, carrying the memory of her sister and a burden from those years spent fighting for an unblemished name. She turned into a symbol of resilience and determination. It is possible to keep moving forward, even in the harshest doubts and unimaginable loss. And to Risa, her story is no longer defined by the mystery of her death, but by the vibrancy of her life. She was a loving daughter, a spirited sister, and a friend to so many. Though her life was cruelly cut short, her memory lives on in the hearts of those who knew and loved her. A resolution in the case of Risa Trexler is surely going to offer hope to countless other families still awaiting closure. That is a reminder that even as justice may be delayed, the truth does have a way of coming to the surface. However long in time it may seem to take, there is always a chance for light through the dark. In the end, this is not a case about tragedy, it's about the resilience of the human spirit, the relentless pursuit of justice, and the enduring love of a sister who refused to stop searching for the truth. That warm Labor Day evening in 1990, a pale moon cast its soft light upon Starkville, Mississippi. It was silent on the streets except for the chirping of crickets, until suddenly an emergency call pierced through. The weak, urgent voice of Catherine Krigler, 81-year-old, was on the other end, begging for help. What happened that night was a saga of savagery that would haunt the small town for decades. Catherine Krigler was a lifetime resident of Starkville, known for her grit and sharp wit. Years and the wheelchair had stolen some of her independence, but little else. Tonight, she was accompanied by her friend Betty Jones, a sweet woman with a bright, broad smile that seemed to light up any room she entered. It had been one of those evenings, ordinary, even uneventful, until the knock on the door. Then there was Betty, ever graceful, going to answer. What happened next defied comprehension. The man on the other side of the door wasted no time. He immediately lunged at Betty with a knife, The attack was swift, merciless. She fought back, but her assailant would give no quarter. The struggle ended in the living room, where the lifeless body of Betty would lie on the floor, the baseball game still playing on the television behind a macabre backdrop to the horror that unfolded. He then turned his attentions to the helpless Catherine in her wheelchair, finding her in another room after moving through the house with an air of chilling purpose. The act that ensued was one of unspeakable violence. Following the assault on Catherine, he left her for dead as the shadows of the night closed in. But Catherine was not one to give up so easily. With all her strength, she crawled to the phone, which was in another part of the house, and bleeding and battered, called 911 for help amidst desperate cries in the dead of night. First responders arrived at the scene, and it was pretty grisly. Betty Jones lay lifeless on the floor of the living room, a lethal knife wound having been inflicted into her throat. The room bore all signs of violent struggle, the echoes of her last moments in a room frozen in time. Catherine, barely holding on to life, had already been taken to the hospital. Detectives searched the house, dusting for fingerprints and collecting any other evidence that would give them a clue to the identity of the criminal. They did find fingerprints, a partially smoked cigarette, and a very distinctive brand of packaging, a kind of package available in only 2 stores in the city. These fragments of evidence, though promising, would not yield an immediate answer. Catherine was treated for her injuries at the hospital. In spite of what she had been through, Catherine was able to give investigators a description of her attacker, a white male with blue eyes, swarthy complexion, and dirty blonde hair. A composite was made, and the Starkville Police Department began an intensive search for suspects. But for all their trying, the investigation soon hit a brick wall. The technology of the time was limited, and the small amount of DNA recovered from the scene could not be analyzed with the precision required to identify a suspect. With each passing day, the case grew colder. 2 months later, the town of Starkville would suffer another loss. Catherine Krigler, never to have recovered from her injuries, finally succumbed. While her death marked the close of an era for this town, to investigators, it reminded them of some unfinished business they carried with them. Years went by, and the case remained a haunting memory for those who had worked it. In 1993, it garnered national attention when it was featured on America's Most Wanted. The episode generated a flurry of tips, but none provided the breakthrough detectives so desperately sought. By the mid-1990s, the case had gone ice cold, but the question posed to the families of Betty Jones and Catherine Krigler was the one wound that simply would not heal, until finally, perhaps against hope, something resembling justice arrived years later. In 2004, Detective David Lott took over the case, 14 years after the murders. He had fresh eyes and was determined to see this case through. Advances in forensic science offered a glimmer of hope, particularly in the realm of DNA analysis. Lott sent the preserved sexual assault kit from Catherine's case to a specialized laboratory, hoping that modern technology could uncover what had long been hidden. It was a gamble that paid off. In 2005, the lab pulled a DNA profile off the kit. It was a monumental breakthrough, direct evidence of the suspect's identity. They plugged it into CODIS, the national DNA database. And for one more time, investigators felt a weight of frustration bear down on them. No matches came up. Detective Lott never gave up. He knew that science was on the move, and sometimes these things take some time. Over the next decade plus, he worked on other new leads, one of which included this new field of genetic genealogy, a revolutionary approach that traces DNA through family trees in hopes of pinpointing relatives of the suspect. It all came to a head in 2018 when forensic genealogists working on that DNA profile hit upon a likely match. 2 brothers, one a respected businessman, and the other with a criminal past. The latter brother, Michael Devon, became the object of investigation. Devon, 51, of Bonneville, Mississippi, was never on the Starkville police radar. His criminal history was minor, all drug-related, and nothing really stood out in his background to suggest he could commit such a terrible crime. But DNA evidence does not lie. That same June 2018, Devon was arrested on an unrelated drug charge. Investigators seized the opportunity to get a fresh DNA sample from him. And when the results came in, they confirmed what detectives already knew. Devon was a match for DNA recovered from Catherine Kriegler's sexual assault kit. The pieces of the puzzle were finally falling into place. Detective Lott and his team confronted Devon in hopes of a confession, but Devon remained tight-lipped, refusing to give any insight into his motives or actions that night. With the evidence mounting against him, Devon was charged with capital murder and sexual assault. The case that had haunted Starkville for nearly 3 decades was finally on the path to resolution. In one of those ironies of fate, the announcement of Devon's arrest coincided with what would have been the 93rd birthday of Betty Jones. For her family, it was a bittersweet moment, a glimmer of justice tinged by painful memories of their loss. As the case moved toward trial, Devon chose to avoid the death penalty by pleading guilty to the charges. He was sentenced to life without parole, a measure of accountability that brought some solace to the victims' families. Yet, for all the answers the investigation had uncovered, one question remained. Why? Devon offered no explanation, leaving the motive for his crimes a mystery. The resolution of the Labor Day murders stood in testament to the people of Starkville, the results of perseverance and forensic science. It was proof that even the coldest of cases could find their way back into the light, offering closure to those who had waited so long in the darkness. As the case moved forward, the town of Starkville prepared for a trial that would finally bring long-awaited justice for Betty Jones and Catherine Kriegler. For years, their names had been whispered in hushed tones, spoken with grief, with anger, with an aching desire for closure. Now, the man responsible was in custody, and the weight of nearly 3 decades of unanswered questions bore down upon the courtroom. Michael Devon sat at the defense table, his face a mask of little emotion as the prosecution laid out the horrors of that night in 1990. The evidence was overwhelming. DNA, a genetic genealogy trail leading directly to him, the brutality of the crimes leaving no room for doubt. The family members of the victims sat in the courtroom, their eyes fixed on this man who had torn their lives to pieces. Some clenched their fists in silent anger, others wiped away silent tears. The memories of that night, the blood-soaked living room, Catherine's frail body in a desperate struggle for life, Betty lying in a pool of her own blood, these were images that never left them. And now they faced the perpetrator. The prosecution painted this vivid picture. Michael Devon was a predator. He had knocked on that door with one intent to kill. His attack was savage, his actions unspeakable, and for all the pain he'd caused, he had remained hidden in plain sight for nearly 3 decades. When it was time for the defense to speak, Devon's attorneys tried to argue for leniency, but their words rang hollow. There was no mitigating factor, no explanation that could soften the horror of what he had done. Then came the moment when the court waited for Devon to speak, to offer an apology, an explanation, anything. He said nothing. Not a word about that night, not a word about his victims, not a word about why he had done it. One more cruelty to the families, who, perhaps naively, had hoped that to hear him acknowledge his crimes, to hear even a flicker of remorse, would somehow provide some sense of closure. Instead, he remained mute, his eyes blank as though none of it meant anything to him. It mattered to Catherine Kriegler, who had spent her final months knowing that the man who brutalized her had walked free. It mattered to Betty Jones, who never got the chance to see justice served. It mattered to the town of Starkville, where the scars of that night had never fully healed. And it mattered to Detective David Lott, who had refused to let the case die, who had carried it with him for years, knowing that one day, science and persistence would bring them to this moment. As the trial pressed on, the families of Betty and Catherine were given the chance to speak, to tell the court, and Devon, exactly what he had taken from them. Her grandson, who as a small boy had seen his then Betty Jones brutally murdered, in fact stood tall, as he would have faced Devon right in the eye, straight-faced, his voice trembling strong. "You stole from me something which I could never get back. I was only a boy then when she was taken, grew up without her hugs, without her laughter, without her love. And you? You went on with your life as if nothing had happened. Well, now it's time for you to lose everything." Others spoke, their voices shaking with sadness and anger. Catherine's niece wept as she recounted the agony her aunt had endured in those final months, the fear, the nightmares, the struggle to find peace knowing her attacker was still out there. And yet, through it all, Devon never flinched. He stared ahead, as though the words bouncing off the courtroom walls did not belong to him. But they did, and the jury saw that. In the end, the trial was short. The evidence was undeniable, and the jury brought back a verdict without much length. When the sentence came from the judge's life in prison with no parole, there was no bursting dramatics, no final plea from Devon. There was only the quiet satisfaction of knowing he would never walk free again. For the families of Betty and Catherine, it was a justice 3 decades after the fact. But justice, they knew, would never equate to closure, because closure would have been Betty living through the years to see her grandbabies grow up. Closure would have meant Catherine's last years in peace rather than terror. Closure would have meant they wouldn't need to be here today for this trial. And with that, as Devon was taken away in handcuffs, the families embraced, not in celebration, but in relief. Finally, after 28 years, the nightmare was over. In the days following the sentencing, the town of Starkville felt the weight of the case begin to lift. There would always be scars, but now there was also resolution. Detective Lott leaned back in his chair, the man who had chased truth for so long and exhaled long and slow. It was finally over, the case that had defined so much of his career. He thought of Catherine, of Betty, of the years gone by, and then he thought of the future. Advances in forensic science had finally allowed them to crack a case thought forever impossible, and if that were the case some 30-odd years later, well then, perhaps, just maybe, there were cold cases waiting in the wings. For the families, the pain would never go away, but there was comfort in knowing their loved ones' names were no longer attached to an unsolved mystery. They were attached to a victory, a testament to what persistence, science, and a refusal to give up could accomplish. And the case would always be remembered for Starkville, not just as a Labor Day murder haunting them for several years, but also as a case where the adage of justice may have been late, but nevertheless managed to come home.